Margaret Coleman walked into Pinnacle Autos in downtown Atlanta with a mix of quiet excitement and nostalgia. At 65, she wasn't the typical customer for this sleek dealership, where sports cars and luxury SUVs gleamed like museum pieces. Today, Margaret wore a simple brown cardigan and black slacks, clutching an old leather satchel filled with documents. For her, this wasn't just a shopping trip. It was the culmination of decades of relentless work, rising from poverty and pushing past prejudice. But within minutes, her joy was snuffed out by cold stares and sharp words from the dealership staff. Pinnacle Autos was a monument to wealth in Atlanta. The modern glass and steel building rose 3 stories, its crystal chandeliers cast in light across a polished marble floor. Cars were arranged with precision, from a fiery red Porsche to a pearl-white Range Rover, each radiating power and privilege. The air was crisp with high-end air conditioning, laced with the scent of new leather and the faint hum of jazz from hidden speakers. This was a place for the rich, people who strode in with fat wallets and bold confidence. To outsiders, Pinnacle Autos was a temple of luxury, but inside, it ran on unspoken rules. If you didn't look like a millionaire, you didn't belong. Margaret paused before a deep blue sedan, her eyes sparkling as her fingers brushed its smooth paint. She dreamed of this moment for years, back to her childhood running around her father's tiny garage in Atlanta's South Side. Now, after building a career from nothing, she wanted to treat herself to a car that wasn't just transport, but a symbol of her triumph. But as she looked up, a young employee near the reception desk caught her eye, not with a welcome, but with a cold, skeptical glance. James Carter, the sales manager at Pinnacle Autos, stood near a sports car, chatting with a customer in a sharp gray suit. At 32, he was tall, with slicked back hair and a practiced smile he reserved for those he deemed worthy. James thrived on the approval of wealthy clients and the fear of his staff. When he glanced at Margaret, his smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. He muttered something to the customer beside him, and they both chuckled softly. Across the showroom, Emily Davis, a 24-year-old rookie employee, sorted papers at the reception desk. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, but her nervous eyes betrayed her inexperience. She'd only been here 3 months. Emily noticed Margaret the moment she walked in, not because she stood out, but because of the calm way she moved through this alien space. But Emily knew the rules at Pinnacle Autos. Don't waste time on people who don't look like buyers. She glanced at James, saw him heading toward Margaret, and her stomach tightened. Something bad was coming. Margaret didn't notice the eyes on her. She smiled faintly, picturing herself behind the wheel of that blue sedan, its engine purring as she cruised down familiar country roads. This was the day she'd waited for, the day she'd prove every struggle was worth it. But as James Carter approached, his smooth voice dripping with arrogance cut through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," James said, his tone polite, but his eyes brimming with disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is Pinnacle Autos, not a used car lot." Margaret turned, her gaze meeting his. Her smile didn't waver, but inside, she felt the familiar chill of judgment she'd faced her whole life. She took a deep breath, ready to respond, but deep down, she knew. This small battle was just beginning. Margaret Coleman stood in the gleaming showroom of Pinnacle Autos, her fingers still resting lightly on the deep blue sedan. The faint jazz in the background couldn't mask the shift in the air as James Carter's words hung between them. "This is Pinnacle Autos, not a used car lot." His voice carried a mocking edge, loud enough for a few nearby staff to hear. Margaret's smile faltered for a split second, but she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze with calm resolve. "I'm here to look at the sedan," she said, her tone steady and polite. "I'd like to know more about it." James tilted his head, his smirk widening as he gave her a once-over. Her brown cardigan and worn leather satchel didn't scream money, and, to him, that was all that mattered. "The sedan, huh?" he said, crossing his arms. "That's a premium model, ma'am. Starts at 6 figures. Sure you're not more comfortable with something simpler?" He glanced over his shoulder at a cluster of staff near the coffee station, and they snickered quietly. Across the room, wealthy customers floated through the space like royalty. A man in a tailored suit sipped espresso while a salesman detailed the custom rims on a black coupe. A woman in a designer coat laughed as an employee offered her a glass of sparkling water, her gold bracelets clinking with every gesture. The staff moved with practiced grace, pulling out chairs, fetching drinks, catering to every whim. But for Margaret, there was no such welcome. No one approached her with a smile or a brochure. She stood alone, an outsider in a world built for the privileged. Emily Davis watched from the reception desk, her hands fidgeting with a stack of forms. She'd seen this before. James picking out people who didn't fit his mold and turning them into a punchline. Margaret's quiet dignity struck her, though. There was something about the older woman's posture, the way she held herself despite James's jab, that made Emily's chest ache. She wanted to step forward, offer help, but the memory of James chewing out a coworker last week for wasting time kept her rooted. She bit her lip and looked down, guilt gnawing at her. James wasn't alone in his judgment. Near the back of the showroom, Richard Powell, the general manager, leaned against a glass wall, sipping a coffee. At 48, with graying temples and a perpetual scowl, Richard ran Pinnacle Autos like his personal fiefdom. He prided himself on keeping the dealership's image pristine, code for catering only to the right clientele. He caught James's eye and nodded slightly, a signal to keep going. James took it as permission. "Look, ma'am," James said, stepping closer to Margaret, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I don't mean to be rude, but we deal with serious buyers here. You sure you didn't get lost on your way to the budget lot down the street?" He chuckled, loud enough to draw a few more laughs from the staff. Richard smirked, shaking his head as if Margaret's presence was a personal insult. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained even. "I know exactly where I am," she said, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd tell me about the car instead of guessing what I can afford." James raised an eyebrow, surprised she didn't back down. Most people he brushed off would shuffle out, embarrassed, but Margaret wasn't budging. He glanced at Richard again, who gave a subtle shrug, as if to say, "Handle it." James turned back to her, his tone sharpening. "All right, fine. The sedan's got a V8 engine, leather interior, top-tier safety tech. But let's be real. Can you even handle something like that? It's not exactly a grocery getter." The dig stung, but Margaret didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in her life, back when she was a kid scrubbing floors with her mom to make ends meet, or later, when bank tellers smirked at her loan applications. She'd built her success brick by brick, and she wasn't here to be schooled by a smug salesman. "I can handle it," she said simply. "Show me the specs." James laughed outright this time, a sharp barking sound that echoed through the showroom. "Specs? Lady, you're something else." He turned to the staff near the coffee station. "Hey, we got a car expert over here." More chuckles rippled through the group, and a few customers glanced over. amused or annoyed by the commotion. Emily clenched her fists under the desk. She hated this. Hated how James turned everything into a show. How Richard let it happen. Margaret didn't deserve this, but Emily's voice stayed trapped in her throat. She'd only kept this job by staying quiet, blending in. Speaking up now could cost her everything. Richard finally stepped forward, his coffee cup still in hand. "What's going on here, James?" he asked, his gruff voice cutting through the laughter. He eyed Margaret like she was a smudge on his perfect showroom. James grinned, gesturing at her. "Just helping this lady find her way. She's got her heart set on the sedan, but I'm thinking she'd be happier at the discount lot." Richard's lips twitched into a half smile. "Yeah, I can see that." He looked at Margaret, his tone flat. "Ma'am, we've got real customers to tend to. If you're not serious, don't waste our time." Margaret met his stare, her expression unshaken. "I'm serious," she said firmly, "and I'd like to be treated like it." The room quieted for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. James and Richard exchanged a look, half amusement, half irritation. They'd made up their minds about her the second she walked in, and no amount of backbone was going to change that. But Margaret wasn't here to beg for their respect. She'd come for something bigger, and she wasn't leaving without a fight. Margaret Coleman stood firm in the middle of Pinnacle Autos, her gaze locked on Richard Powell as his dismissive words, "Don't waste our time," lingered in the air. The showroom's jazz hummed softly, but it couldn't drown out the sting of his tone or the smirks of James Carter and the other staff. Margaret's hands tightened around her leather satchel, but her face stayed calm. She'd faced this kind of treatment before, and each time it fueled her fire. As James turned away with a chuckle, her mind drifted back to where it all began, to the roots of why she was here today. Growing up in Atlanta's South Side, Margaret had known struggle from the start. Her father, Henry Coleman, ran a small auto repair shop in a cramped lot behind their weathered row house. The garage was a patchwork of rusting tools and oil-stained concrete, but to Margaret, it was a kingdom. She'd sit on an old milk crate, watching Henry coax life back into engines others had given up on. His hands, rough and stained, moved with a quiet magic, and his low voice would hum gospel tunes as he worked. "Cars are more than metal, Maggie," he'd say. "They're freedom. One day, you'll drive something that tells the world you made it." Henry had dreamed of owning a sleek Cadillac, the kind he'd seen in glossy magazines at the barber shop. But in the 1960s, a black mechanic with a sixth-grade education didn't get loans or fancy cars. Banks turned him away with tight smiles and vague excuses, and Margaret, barely 10, would overhear the whispers. "Folks like him don't belong in our offices." It cut deep, but Henry never let it break him. He'd ruffle Margaret's hair and say, "You'll do what I couldn't, girl. Promise me that." She'd nodded, her young heart swearing to keep that vow. Life wasn't kind to the Colemans. Henry died of a heart attack when Margaret was 16, leaving her and her mother, Ruth, to fend for themselves. Ruth took up cleaning jobs, and Margaret worked after school, delivering newspapers, scrubbing dishes, anything to keep the lights on. But she never forgot the garage or her father's dream. She clawed her way through night classes at a community college, then earned a business degree from Georgia State, all while juggling 2 jobs. By her 30s, she'd started a small logistics company, hauling freight with a single beat-up truck. Through grit and sleepless nights, she grew it into Coleman Transport. a multi-million-dollar firm with contracts across the Southeast. Today, Margaret had walked into Pinnacle Autos not on a whim, but with purpose. She'd spent decades building her empire, sacrificing weekends, holidays, even relationships, to prove she could rise above the rejections her family had endured. The blue sedan wasn't just a car, it was her Cadillac, her way of honoring Henry's dream and silencing the voices that had once told her she didn't belong. She'd planned this purchase for months, researching models, crunching numbers, ready to pay cash. But the staff at Pinnacle Autos couldn't see that. To them, she was just an old woman in a cardigan, out of place and unworthy. Back in the showroom, James's laughter snapped her out of her reverie. "Come on, Richard, let's get back to the real business," he said, waving a hand dismissively at Margaret. Richard nodded, already turning toward a couple admiring a silver SUV. The husband wore a Rolex, the wife carried a designer purse. A salesman rushed over with a tray of bottled water, all smiles and deference. Margaret watched the scene, a familiar ache settling in her chest. She'd seen this double standard her whole life. Doors opening for some, slamming shut for others. Emily Davis, still at the reception desk, caught Margaret's eye for a moment. The young woman's face flickered with something, sympathy, maybe shame, but she quickly looked down, busying herself with papers. Margaret didn't blame her. She knew what it was like to be small in a big machine, afraid to speak up. But Margaret wasn't afraid anymore. She'd spent too long fighting to let this moment slip away. James strutted back toward her, his patience clearly thinning. "Look, ma'am, I've got people waiting who actually buy cars," he said, his voice sharp now. "If you're just here to window shop, take it somewhere else." He pointed toward the glass doors, his gesture a clear command to leave. Margaret adjusted her satchel, her lips pressing into a thin line. She could walk out, let them have their petty victory, but that wasn't who she was. She'd built Coleman Transport by facing down bigger bullies than James Carter. Bankers who laughed at her proposals, competitors who sabotaged her bids. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about the principle. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll do what I couldn't." "I'm not leaving," she said quietly, her words cutting through the showroom's hum. "Not until you treat me like a customer." James froze, his smirk fading. Richard turned back, his scowl deepening. The staff went silent, and a few customers glanced over, sensing the tension. Margaret stood tall, her satchel heavy with the weight of her past and the promise of her fight. She wasn't just here for a sedan. She was here to reclaim something bigger, something no one in this room could take away. Margaret Coleman's words, "I'm not leaving," hung in the air of Pinnacle Autos like a quiet thunderclap. The showroom's polished sheen seemed to dim under the weight of her resolve, and for a moment, the soft jazz was the only sound. James Carter stood frozen mid-stride, his smug grin replaced by a flicker of surprise. Richard Powell turned fully now, his coffee cup forgotten on a nearby display table, his scowl deepening into something harder. Margaret adjusted her satchel and met their stares, her calm exterior hiding the storm of memory and determination brewing within. James recovered first, stepping closer with a forced laugh. "Lady, you've got some nerve," he said, his voice loud enough to draw every eye in the room. "You think you can just stand there and demand stuff? This isn't a charity showroom." He gestured at the blue sedan she'd admired. "That car's worth more than most people see in a decade. You sure you're not lost?" Margaret didn't blink. "I'm sure," she said, her tone even but firm. "I came here for that sedan. I'd like you to show it to me, properly." The request was simple, but to James, it was a challenge. He glanced at Richard, expecting backup, and got it. Richard stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over Margaret. "Ma'am, we don't have time for games," he said, his voice gruff and final. "You're holding up my staff. If you're not buying, and I'm guessing you're not, then you need to go." Around them, the showroom buzzed with a new energy. Customers paused their conversations, turning to watch. A man in a pinstripe suit raised an eyebrow over his espresso. A woman with a pearl necklace whispered to her companion, her lips curling in mild amusement. The staff, clustered near the coffee station, exchanged smirks, enjoying the spectacle. But Emily Davis, still at the reception desk, gripped her pen tighter, her knuckles whitening. She hated this, hated how James and Richard turned Margaret into a sideshow. But fear kept her silent, her eyes darting between them. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying Richard. "I'm not playing games," she said. "I asked about the car. You're the ones making this harder than it needs to be." James snorted, crossing his arms. "Oh, we're making it hard? That's rich. Look, I'll humor you." He grabbed a brochure from a nearby stand and tossed it onto the sedan's hood, letting it slide toward her. "There. Specs, features, price, all 6 figures of it. Happy now? Or do you need me to read it to you?" The sarcasm hit like a slap, but Margaret didn't flinch. She picked up the brochure, smoothing it with steady hands. "Thank you," she said, her politeness a quiet rebuke. "But I'd still like to hear about it from you. That's your job, isn't it?" The room went still again. James's jaw tightened, his bravado cracking under her unshakable calm. He wasn't used to this, people folding under his jabs, sure, but not pushing back with such steady grace. Richard stepped in, his patience gone. "Enough," he snapped. "You're not here to buy. You're here to waste our time. I've seen it before. Folks like you coming in, acting big, then walking out with nothing." "Folks like me?" Margaret repeated, her voice low but sharp. The question caught Richard off guard, and for a split second, his scowl faltered. She pressed on. "What does that mean exactly?" Richard's face reddened, but James jumped in before he could answer. "It means you don't fit here," he said bluntly, dropping all pretense. "Look around. This isn't your scene. Why don't you save us all the trouble and head down to the budget lot? They've got plenty of beaters for—" He paused, smirking. "People on a fixed income." The insult landed hard, and a few staff laughed outright. The pinstripe suit man chuckled into his cup. The pearl necklace woman shook her head, as if Margaret's audacity offended her. But Margaret's expression didn't change. She'd heard worse, far worse, over the years. Bankers calling her unqualified, despite perfect credit. Clients doubting her because she didn't wear a suit or a white face. She'd built Coleman Transport through thicker mud than this. "I'd like to speak to someone else," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. "Someone who knows how to do their job." James's smirk vanished. "You don't get to pick," he shot back. "I'm what you've got, and I'm done wasting my breath." He turned to Richard. "Boss, she's all yours. I've got actual buyers waiting." Richard waved a hand. "No, I'm done too." He raised his voice, addressing the room. "Someone get security. We've got a loiterer who won't take a hint." The word loiterer stung, but Margaret stood taller. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with dismay. She opened her mouth to protest, then clamped it shut, fear winning out. A few customers murmured, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably. The staff near the coffee station dispersed, one heading for the phone, Margaret adjusted her satchel again, her movements deliberate. Call whoever you want, she said softly. I'm still not leaving until I'm treated right. Richard scoffed. You'll leave when we say you leave. He nodded to James. Make it quick. James pulled out his phone, dialing security with exaggerated flair. Yeah, we've got a problem in the showroom, he said loudly, smirking at Margaret. Some lady won't go. Send someone up. The call ended, and James leaned against the sedan, arms crossed, triumphant. Richard turned back to his coffee, dismissing her entirely. The room settled into an uneasy hum, waiting for the next move. But Margaret didn't budge. She'd face down bigger men, bigger threats, and come out on top. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her father's words rang in her ears. You'll do what I couldn't. She wasn't just fighting for a car now. She was fighting for every door slammed in her face, every laugh thrown her way. And she wasn't about to lose. The showroom of Pinnacle Autos buzzed with tension as James Carter hung up his phone, his smirk firmly in place. Security's on the way, he announced, loud enough for the scattered customers and staff to hear. Margaret Coleman stood by the blue sedan, her leather satchel clutched in one hand, her posture unyielding despite the weight of every eye on her. Richard Powell gave a curt nod, already turning back to his coffee, as if Margaret's presence was a minor annoyance now resolved. But for Margaret, this wasn't the end. It was the spark. Emily Davis watched from the reception desk, her heart pounding. She'd seen James and Richard push people around before. Tourists, lowballers, anyone who didn't fit their mold. But something about Margaret's quiet strength made this different. Emily wanted to say something, anything to stop this, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd barely held onto this job by keeping her head down, and crossing James meant risking it all. Still, her eyes lingered on Margaret, a silent apology she couldn't voice. Footsteps echoed from the back of the showroom, heavy and deliberate. A security guard emerged, tall, broad-shouldered with a buzz cut and a stern frown. His name tag read Mike, and his dark uniform gave him an air of authority. He scanned the room, locking onto Margaret as James pointed her out with a lazy wave. That's her, James said. Won't leave. Thinks she's a VIP or something. Mike approached Margaret, his steps slowing as he got closer. Up close, he saw her calm face, her steady gaze, not the flustered troublemaker he'd expected. Ma'am, he said, his voice gruff but cautious, I've been asked to escort you out. They say you're disrupting things. Margaret looked up at him, her expression unshaken. I'm not disrupting anything, she said softly. I asked to see a car. They decided I don't belong here. That's their problem, not mine. Mike shifted his weight, glancing back at James, who rolled his eyes. Come on, Mike. Do your job, James snapped. She's wasting everyone's time. The guard hesitated, his frown deepening. He'd worked here long enough to know James's game, picking on people for sport, but something about Margaret's dignity gave him pause. Still, orders were orders. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, quieter now. I have to ask you to leave. Please don't make this harder. Margaret nodded once, a small acknowledgement of his position. I understand, she said. She turned toward the glass doors, her steps measured, her back straight. The room watched in silence. No more laughter, just a heavy stillness. James leaned against the sedan, grinning like he'd won a prize. Richard sipped his coffee, already dismissing her. A few customers whispered, some relieved, others uneasy. Emily's chest tightened as Margaret passed her desk. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Margaret offered a faint, reassuring smile, almost as if she knew something Emily didn't. Then she was gone. the door sliding shut behind her with a soft hiss. Outside, Margaret walked to her car, a modest gray Toyota parked at the far end of the lot. The Atlanta sun beat down, glinting off the dealership's glass facade, but she barely felt the heat. She slid into the driver's seat, closing the door with a soft thud. For a moment, she sat still, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of holding herself together. She reached into her satchel, pulled out her phone, and took a deep breath. They thought they'd won, but they didn't know her. Not yet. Margaret's mind raced back to the battles she'd fought. Bankers who'd sneered at her startup loan applications, suppliers who'd tried to cheat her, competitors who'd underestimated her. Each time, she'd turned their doubt into fuel. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about every time she'd been told she didn't belong. She unlocked her phone and started typing, her fingers moving with purpose. First, she texted her assistant, Sarah Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd been with Coleman Transport for a decade. "Sarah, call me now. Urgent." Then she scrolled to another contact. Thomas Reed, a friend from her college days, who now sat on the board of Pinnacle Auto's parent company. She typed, "Tom, I need to talk. Just got kicked out of your Atlanta dealership for no reason. This is bigger than me." She hit send, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her phone buzzed almost instantly. "Sarah." Margaret answered, her voice steady. "Sarah, I need you to pull every connection we've got to Pinnacle Auto's corporate office. I want a meeting with their board. Today, if possible." Sarah didn't hesitate. "What happened, boss?" she asked, her tone clipped but concerned. "They judged me before I opened my mouth," Margaret said. "Treated me like trash and called security. I'm not letting this slide." "Got it," Sarah replied. "I'll make the calls. Sit tight." Margaret ended the call and stared out the windshield at the dealership's gleaming front. Her next move was already forming. She dialed Thomas Reed directly, and he picked up on the second ring. "Margaret?" His deep voice came through, warm but surprised. "What's going on?" "Tom, your people at Pinnacle just humiliated me," she said, cutting to the chase. "I walked in to buy a car, cash, and they kicked me out because I didn't look the part. This isn't just about me. It's how they run things." Thomas went silent for a beat, then sighed. "That's unacceptable. I'll escalate it. Give me an hour." "Thanks, Tom," she said, hanging up. She set the phone on the dashboard, her gaze hardening. She wasn't some nobody they could brush off. Coleman Transport moved half the freight in this region, and she had friends in high places, friends who'd listen. The wheels were turning now, and Pinnacle Autos had no idea what was coming. Margaret leaned back in her seat, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. She'd faced worse than James and Richard. Men with bigger egos and sharper claws. And she'd buried them all. This time, she'd do more than win. She'd make sure no one else walked into that showroom and left feeling small. Her father's dream wasn't just about a car. It was about dignity. And she was ready to fight for it. Margaret Coleman sat in her gray Toyota, the engine idling softly as she watched the glass doors of Pinnacle Autos from across the lot. The Atlanta sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the dealership's sleek facade. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard. Thomas Reed, texting back. "Boards alerted. I've got 2 members heading your way. Stay put." Margaret's faint smile grew sharper. She'd waited less than an hour, but it was enough. The pieces were falling into place, and she was ready to step back inside. Not as a customer, but as a force. Inside the showroom, James Carter leaned against the reception desk, regaling a group of staff with his version of Margaret's exit. "You should have seen her face," he said, grinning. "Thought she could boss me around, but security shut that down quick." The staff laughed, a few nodding in approval. Richard Powell stood nearby, scrolling through his phone, a satisfied smirk on his face. They'd moved on, back to their routine. James charming a young couple eyeing a red convertible, Richard sipping a fresh coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. Emily Davis stayed quiet at her desk, her hands busy with paperwork, but her mind elsewhere. Margaret's parting smile haunted her, a look that said this wasn't over. Emily had wanted to speak up, to tell James he'd gone too far, but fear had won. Now, guilt gnawed at her, and she kept glancing at the doors, half expecting something to happen. It did. The glass doors slid open with a hiss, and Margaret walked in, her steps steady and deliberate. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were two men in crisp suits, Charles Bennett and Laura Hayes, board members of Pinnacle Auto's parent company. Charles, a tall man with silver hair, carried a leather briefcase. Laura, sharp-eyed and poised, held a tablet. Behind them came Susan Grant, Margaret's lawyer, a woman with a steel gaze and a reputation for cutting through nonsense. The air in the showroom shifted, conversations trailing off as heads turned. James straightened up, his grin fading. "What the?" he muttered, nudging Richard. Richard looked up, his coffee cup pausing mid-sip, his scowl returning. The staff froze, and customers glanced over, sensing the sudden weight in the room. Emily's pen slipped from her hand, clattering onto the desk. She recognized Margaret instantly, and her heart raced. This was no ordinary return. Margaret stopped near the blue sedan, her satchel still in hand. Charles and Laura stood slightly behind her, their stern faces scanning the space. Susan adjusted her glasses, her presence a quiet threat. Margaret's eyes locked onto James, then Richard, and she let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. Richard recovered first, plastering on a fake smile as he rushed forward. "Well, hello again, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "Didn't expect you back so soon. What can I do for you this time?" He glanced at Charles and Laura, confusion flickering in his eyes, but he kept up the act. James followed, his tone oily with sudden politeness. "Yeah, welcome back. Must have missed us, huh? Let's make this visit perfect. Coffee, water, whatever you need." He flashed his salesman smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He hadn't clocked the board members yet, still thinking he could charm his way out. Margaret didn't respond. She let them squirm, her calm gaze cutting deeper than words. The memory of their laughter, their sneers, fueled her silence. She'd spent a lifetime proving herself to men like them. Arrogant, blind, quick to judge. And today, she'd turned their game upside down. Charles stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. "Richard Powell, I presume?" he said, eyeing the general manager. "And James Carter? We're here about a complaint, a serious one. Care to explain why a valued shareholder was mocked and removed from this dealership earlier today?" Richard's smile vanished, his face paling. "Shareholder?" he stammered, glancing at Margaret. There must be some mistake." James laughed nervously, stepping in. "Yeah, this is a mix-up, right? She came in, we talked, maybe wires got crossed. Happens all the time with so many customers." He forced another grin, but it wobbled under Charles's stare. Margaret finally spoke, her voice quiet but piercing. "No mistake," she said. "You didn't ask me a thing when I walked in. You looked at me, decided who I was, and treated me like dirt. Is that how you run this place? Richard's mouth opened, then closed. James shifted, his bravado crumbling. "Look, ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his tone defensive now. "If we'd known—" "Known what?" Margaret cut in, her eyes narrowing. "That I'm not just some old lady you can laugh at? I shouldn't have to prove myself to get basic decency. No one should." The room went dead silent. Customers stared. Staff shrank back. Emily's breath caught, a mix of awe and relief washing over her. Charles cleared his throat, addressing Richard again. "This isn't just unprofessional. It's a violation of our company's core values. We're here to get answers, and we're not leaving until we do." Richard's face flushed, sweat beading on his brow. "We didn't know who she was," he muttered, glancing at James for support. "If she'd said—" "Said what?" Laura snapped, her tablet glowing with notes. "She's a customer. That's enough. Your job isn't to play gatekeeper. It's to serve." James swallowed hard, his usual swagger gone. The couple by the convertible edged away, whispering. The staff near the coffee station avoided eye contact, sensing the tide turning. Margaret turned slightly, her gaze softening as it landed on Emily. "You," she said gently. "Come here." Emily blinked, startled, then stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Me?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," Margaret said. "You didn't laugh. You didn't join in. That matters." Emily's cheeks flushed and she nodded, overwhelmed. Margaret turned back to Richard and James, her voice steady. "You thought you could push me out. You were wrong." Charles adjusted his briefcase, his tone final. "We'll handle this now. Step aside, both of you." The board members moved forward, and Susan Grant pulled out a legal pad, ready to document every word. Margaret stood tall, the blue sedan gleaming behind her. The reckoning had begun, and Pinnacle Autos would never be the same. The showroom of Pinnacle Autos stood still, the air thick with the weight of Margaret Coleman's return. Charles Bennett's command, "Step aside, both of you," echoed off the glass walls, silencing the last murmurs. Margaret stood by the blue sedan, her leather satchel a quiet testament to her journey, her calm gaze fixed on James Carter and Richard Powell. The board members, Charles and Laura Hayes, flanked her, their stern faces unyielding, while Susan Grant, her lawyer, scribbled notes with a precision that promised consequences. The staff and customers watched, caught in a moment that felt bigger than the sleek cars around them. Richard's hands twitched at his sides, his earlier confidence replaced by a sheen of sweat. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice rising. "We didn't know she was a shareholder. How were we supposed to guess that?" He gestured at Margaret, his tone desperate. "She didn't say anything. She just stood there, acting entitled." James nodded quickly, jumping in. "Yeah, exactly. We deal with dozens of people a day. We can't read minds. If she'd told us who she was, none of this would have happened." His salesman charm was gone, replaced by a frantic edge, his eyes darting between the board members and Margaret. Margaret's voice cut through their excuses, steady and cold. "I told you I wanted to buy a car," she said. "That should have been enough. You didn't ask questions. You made assumptions. You laughed, mocked me, called security. That's not a mistake. That's who you are." Charles raised a hand, silencing Richard's next protest. "Enough," he said, his tone sharp. "We've heard the story from Mrs. Coleman, and it's corroborated by witnesses." He nodded toward Emily Davis, who stood nervously near the reception desk, her wide eyes locked on the scene. "This isn't about what she didn't say. It's about what you did. And it's unacceptable." Laura stepped forward, her tablet glowing with data. "Pinnacle Autos stands for excellence," she said, her voice crisp. That means every customer, every time. What we've seen today, prejudice, disrespect, outright hostility, violates everything this company claims to be. You've damaged our reputation, and we're fixing that now. Richard's face twisted, a mix of panic and defiance. Fixing it how? He demanded. You can't pin this all on us. We were doing our jobs, keeping the riffraff out. Riffraff, Margaret repeated, her voice low but searing. I walked in with cash to buy that sedan outright. I built a company that employs hundreds, moves millions in goods, and you called me riffraff because I don't wear diamonds or strut like you? She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. You don't even know what a customer looks like. The room flinched at her words. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some ashamed, others stunned. The young couple by the convertible slipped toward the exit, their interest in the car forgotten. The staff near the coffee station stared at the floor, their earlier smirks wiped clean. Emily clutched her hands, a spark of admiration breaking through her fear. Charles adjusted his briefcase, his decision clear. Richard Powell, as of this moment, you're relieved of your duties as general manager, he said. James Carter, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. We won't tolerate this behavior. Not here, not anywhere in our company. Gasps rippled through the showroom. Richard's jaw dropped, his face turning a deep red. You can't do this, he shouted. I've run this place for 10 years. You're throwing me out over her? Over her? Laura snapped. Over a shareholder who exposed a rot in this dealership. Over a customer you humiliated. Yes, we can. And we are. James stumbled back, his hands raised. Wait, this is crazy. I was just following his lead. He pointed at Richard, desperation cracking his voice. He sets the tone here. I didn't save it, Susan Grant interjected, her pen pausing. We've got statements, timestamps, and a room full of witnesses. You're done. Her steel gaze shut him down, and he fell silent, his shoulders slumping. Margaret turned away from them, her focus shifting to Emily. You, she said again, her tone softening. Step up here. Emily hesitated, then walked forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble floor. Yes, ma'am, she said, her voice trembling but curious. You didn't join in, Margaret said. You didn't laugh or push me out. That's more than anyone else here did today. What's your name? Emily Davis, she replied, swallowing hard. Margaret nodded, then looked at Charles and Laura. Emily showed respect when no one else did, she said. This place needs someone like her, someone who sees people, not just wallets. I'd like her to take over, at least for now. Charles raised an eyebrow, glancing at Laura, who gave a slight nod. Interim manager? He asked Emily. You're young, but if Mrs. Coleman vouches for you, we'll back it. Training starts tomorrow. Emily's eyes widened, tears prickling at the corners. Me? I don't know what to say, she stammered. Thank you, ma'am. I won't mess this up. You won't, Margaret said, a warm smile breaking through her stern facade. You've got what they don't. Heart. Richard lunged forward, his voice a growl. This is insane. You're giving my job to her? She's a nobody. Enough, Charles barked, his patience gone. Security's already on its way. For you two this time. Get your things and go. Mike the guard reappeared from the back, his face grim but resigned. He gestured toward Richard and James. Let's move, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Richard glared at Margaret, then stormed toward his office, muttering curses. James followed, his head down, the fight drained out of him. Margaret watched them go, then turned to the remaining staff. Respect isn't a privilege you hand out, she said, her voice carrying across the room. It's a rule. Break it, and you're out. That's how this place runs now. The board members nodded, Charles stepping in to take charge. We're reviewing everything. Policies, staff, culture, he said. Mrs. Coleman staying involved. This stops today. Margaret adjusted her satchel, her eyes drifting to the blue sedan. It gleamed under the lights. A quiet promise fulfilled. She'd come for a car, but she'd left with something bigger. Justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been dismissed. Her father's dream shone brighter than ever, and she'd made it real. The tension in Pinnacle Autos drained away as Richard Powell and James Carter disappeared into the back office with Mike, the security guard, trailing them. The showroom's marble floor gleamed under the chandelier light, but the air felt different now. Lighter, cleaner. As if Margaret Coleman's stand had swept away years of arrogance. She stood near the blue sedan, her leather satchel resting on its hood, her eyes scanning the space she'd just reshaped. Charles Bennett and Laura Hayes conferred quietly, with Susan Grant issuing orders to the remaining staff, while Emily Davis lingered nearby, still processing her sudden rise. Margaret took a deep breath, the faint scent of leather and polish grounding her. She'd come here for a car, but she'd walked away with something far greater. A victory not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been judged and dismissed. The board members moved with purpose, their voices firm as they outlined the next steps. Full review starts tomorrow, Charles said to the staff. Policies rewritten, mandatory training, random audits. Mrs. Coleman's overseeing this. Consider her word final. Laura nodded, tapping her tablet. We're pulling records of every complaint filed here in the last year, she added. If this happened to her, it's happened before. That ends now. The staff, those who hadn't laughed or joined in, nodded silently, some relieved, others wary. The customers who'd stayed watched with a mix of awe and curiosity, their earlier whispers replaced by quiet respect. Margaret turned to Emily, who stood clutching a notepad, her brown hair slipping from its tie. Emily, she said gently, this place is yours to lead now, at least until they sort it out. You ready? Emily swallowed, her voice shaky but determined. I think so, ma'am. I don't want to let you down. This is huge. You won't, Margaret said, her smile warm and steady. You saw me when no one else did. That's enough to start with. Build from there. Make this a place where people walk in and feel welcome, not judged. Can you do that? Emily's eyes glistened, but she straightened up. Yes, ma'am. I'll try. I will. I promise. Good, Margaret said. Leadership isn't about power. It's about purpose. You've got the heart for it. The rest you'll learn. Charles approached, his briefcase in hand. We'll set her up with training and a mentor, he said to Margaret. She's green, but she's got potential. You're right about her. He paused, then lowered his voice. You sure you don't want a bigger role here? After today, you could run the whole chain if you wanted. Margaret chuckled softly, shaking her head. No thanks. I've got my company to run. Freight doesn't move itself. I just want this place fixed. That's all. For me, for my dad, for everyone who deserves better. Charles nodded, respecting her choice. Fair enough. We'll keep you in the loop. This won't slide back. I guarantee it. As the board members wrapped up, Margaret walked over to the blue sedan, running her hand along its sleek frame. It was more than a car now. It was a symbol, a piece of her father's dream made real. She'd promised Henry she'd do what he couldn't, and today she had. Not just by buying the car, but by tearing down the walls that had kept people like him out. Susan Grant joined her, tucking her legal pad away. "Paperwork's done," she said. "You're cleared to take it home whenever you're ready. Paid in full, just like you wanted." Margaret smiled, a quiet triumph in her eyes. "Thanks, Susan. Let's get it ready." An hour later, the staff, under Emily's tentative direction, rolled the sedan out to the lot. Margaret slipped into the driver's seat, her hands settling on the smooth leather wheel. The engine purred to life, a deep, satisfying rumble that echoed through her bones. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching her own reflection. Calm, strong, unbroken. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement. Emily stood by the curb, waving awkwardly as Margaret pulled out. "Thank you, Mrs. Coleman," she called. "I mean it," Margaret waved back. "You've got this, Emily. Make it right." The sedan glided onto the Atlanta streets, the city lights streaking past as Margaret drove. Her mind drifted to Henry's garage, the oil-stained floors, the gospel hum, the dreams he'd planted in her. She'd honored them all today, not with anger or vengeance, but with a strength that changed things. Pinnacle Autos wouldn't forget her, and neither would the people who'd walk through its doors from now on. Back at the dealership, Emily gathered the staff, her voice unsteady but growing firmer. "We're doing this different now," she said. "No more picking who's worthy. Everyone gets a shot. That's how it's going to be." The team nodded, some hesitant, others eager. The old ways were gone, and a new day was starting. Margaret turned onto a quiet road, the sedan hugging the curves as she headed home. Her phone buzzed. Sarah checking in. "You good, boss?" her assistant asked. "Better than good," Margaret replied. "Tell the team we've got a story for the next meeting. And maybe a new car to show off." Sarah laughed. "Can't wait to hear it." As the call ended, Margaret pressed the gas, the sedan surging forward. She'd faced down prejudice with grace and walked away with more than a prize. She'd built a legacy. Her father's voice whispered in her mind, "You made it, Maggie." She had, and she'd made sure no one else would have to fight as hard to do the same. The road stretched ahead, open and free, just like she'd always dreamed.